Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Books of Blood Volume 3 by Clive Barker. Now, Books of Blood is a 6-volume anthology published between the years 1984 and 1985. Now, I already reviewed the first 2 volumes of this series, and I'll leave links in the description below to where you can check out those reviews. Now, it was really this 6-volume anthology that made Clive Barker sort of a minor superstar in the world of horror literature and got the attention of people like Ramsey Campbell, Alan Moore, and Stephen King. Actually, it was this collection that got Stephen King to famously call Clive Barker the future of horror fiction. Now, I actually think Clive Barker owes a lot to that quote from Stephen King, because I think it was that quote and Stephen King's initial review of Books of Blood that got people to check out this collection and got people to check out Clive Barker's work in general. And I think Clive Barker would be the first to admit that, but that's not to denigrate his work at all, because honestly, I feel like compared to Stephen King, there's a real philosophy to Clive Barker's work that is just not present in the work of his contemporaries. Like, Clive Barker's work for the time was very transgressive, and I honestly feel he went places in his stories that his contemporaries were afraid to go. Now, Clive Barker also sort of popularized the literary subgenre of splatterpunk, but again, there is a philosophy to his work and sort of an intellectual aspect that is not present in his imitators. Now, in this video, I'm going to be reviewing each individual story from this volume, but frequently throughout the video, I'm going to cut back and forth to my friend Mark Allan Gunnells, giving his thoughts on this volume and the stories contained in it. Now, the interesting thing about my friend Mark is he's actually a writer himself, and he has sort of a Clive Barker connection, because he wrote a short story for a contest that Clive Barker was doing, and apparently Clive Barker really liked his story.
Hello, Mark Allan Gunnells here. My friend Christian James Dorier has asked me to do a short video review of Clive Barker's Books of Blood Volume 3. This is the edition I have that collects all of the first 3 volumes, but this review is specifically for Volume 3, so I'm going to do a brief review of each story, and then sort of a wrap-up of my feelings of the volume as a whole.
Now, the first story in this volume is called Son of Celluloid, and this is probably the best of all the stories contained in this volume. Basically, it's about this movie theater where it seems that the movies are coming to life, and all these long-dead Hollywood stars like Peter Lorre and Marilyn Monroe and John Wayne are apparently coming back to life. Or so it seems. Now, you certainly have seen stories like this before, and at first it seems like this is going to be a typical ghost story where maybe these really are the ghosts of these Hollywood stars come back to life, but oh no, when you find out what's actually causing this to go on at this movie theater, it is one of the most unique twists on this concept that I've ever seen in my life. Like, it is so intensely original, and I almost want to say that it's a twist that only Clive Barker could have come up with, but the story does have elements of Cronenbergian body horror. Like, I could almost see David Cronenberg coming up with a story almost like this. But not only is it a great horror story, but it's also a love letter to old Hollywood and to movies in general. And it's also a commentary on what movies do to us, both positive and negative, like what movies do to our culture and for our culture, as well as the thoughts and emotions that movies invoke. It really is a great story. Now, there was a comic book adaptation of this story written by Steve Niles, who also wrote 30 Days of Night. Now, actually, in this video, I was showing the cover of the comic right here just to give sort of a visual representation of the story. Now, I've never read the comic, so I can't speak to how faithful it is to the source material. But here's my friend Mark Allan Gunnells giving his thoughts on Son of Celluloid. Now, keep in mind, in his review, he does give away some spoilers.
Volume 3 starts with the story Son of Celluloid. For me, it is definitely the best story in this particular collection, and also, I think, one of the best stories as a whole for the entire Books of Blood series. It's sort of a ghost story, but with a very unique twist, also kind of a send-up of old Hollywood. And the premise is very original. It is about a building that basically gets cancer, like a cancer that actually infects a physical structure. In this case, it is a movie theater, and it starts to bring the images from the movies to life. And they are angry, and they are bloodthirsty. It is such an original idea, and such an original take on the haunted house or ghost story. That, again, it is definitely one of my favorite stories. I also happen to have a comic that was made about this particular story, Son of Celluloid, which is also excellent, and some great art in there.
So, the next story in the collection is Rawhead Rex, which is probably the most famous story from this particular volume, and on the surface, it appears to be your typical monster on the loose story, but it's a monster on the loose story as only Clive Barker could write, I think. Now, from what I understand, Rawhead actually is something from British folklore. I think it's like a boogeyman-like figure, and this is sort of Clive Barker's take on that legend. So, the plot of Rawhead Rex is it's about this small English village, and it begins where this farmer removes a stone on his property, and he accidentally releases this ancient god, or at least a being that was worshipped as a god thousands of years ago, called Rawhead Rex, and now it terrorizes this small town, and there's this crazed priest who starts to believe that Rawhead Rex is the one true god. Again, it sounds like the typical monster on the loose story, and it is for the most part, but there are so many things in here that are just so pure Clive Barker, like the priest who basically becomes Rawhead Rex's right-hand man. He basically gets baptized by Rawhead Rex, and the way he gets baptized is basically Rawhead gives the priest a golden shower. And the story definitely has sort of a commentary on religion, where you have this, like, pagan god coming back in the age of Christianity, and it touches on how a Catholic priest would respond to that. But the story also is sort of a commentary on masculinity versus femininity, where it's never explicitly stated in the story, but basically Rawhead's head is supposed to be a giant penis, and it is something feminine that ends up defeating Rawhead at the end of the story. And the story gets freaking brutal. Like, you have Rawhead eating kids in this story. Like, I could definitely see why this story has kind of become a fan favorite among Clive Barker fans. Now, this story was adapted into a film of the same name in 1985. Now, Clive Barker, despite writing the screenplay for the film, really is not happy with what the filmmakers made of his story, and I can kinda understand why. It's not a very good movie at all. It's kind of fun in a B-movie sort of way, but again, it's not really a good movie. It also doesn't help that in the movie, Rawhead Rex looks like a goddamn Power Rangers villain. Now, the movie is actually what prompted Clive Barker to make the movie Hellraiser based on his book, The Hellbound Heart, because he was not happy with what they did with that story, so he kind of wanted to adapt his own work himself. Now, there was a comic book adaptation of this story. I've never read the comic, so I can't speak to how true it is to the original story. Now, Clive Barker would write a book called Cabal, which was later adapted into the movie Nightbreed, and there actually was a comic book series based on Nightbreed. I think the comics kind of acted as a sequel to the movie, but Rawhead Rex actually did show up in a few of the Nightbreed comics. I know the Cenobites also showed up in a few of those comics as well. Now here's my friend Mark giving his thoughts on Rawhead Rex.
So the next story in Volume 3 is Rawhead Rex. In some ways, this is a very traditional monster story, which I like, because I like monster stories, about this big hulking creature that has been freed from like an underground prison and just goes on a rampage through this small village. I love the setting of this, the very small village that is kind of isolated, with the creature sort of like, creating havoc and death there. Definitely a very enjoyable story, and it also goes to show how Barker can take an idea that is, on the surface, a very traditional, familiar idea, and just really put his stamp on it and give you something full of passion and intelligence and surprises. So, I know Rawhead Rex was made into a movie back in the early 80s that Barker himself has pretty much disowned. I'm not sure I've ever seen that movie all the way through. What I have seen of it, I just know the effects were really bad, and so I can't really comment on that.
So, the third story contained in Volume 3 is Confessions of a Pornographer's Shroud, and basically it's about this guy who is a devout Catholic, and he's very conservative, but overall he's a pretty decent guy, but it turns out that his bosses are actually involved in organized crime, and they're also involved in an illegal pornography ring, and they end up framing him as being the ringleader of this ring, and they basically ruin his life. So he goes to get revenge on them, but they end up murdering him, and then his ghost comes back to kill them, but his ghost ends up taking possession of the shroud that was over his body in the morgue. Basically, it's a take on the whole stereotypical bedsheet ghost thing, where the ghost is literally a bedsheet, or a shroud in this case. In a lot of ways, it's the typical ghost story, but done in a very funny and satirical way. But it's also sad, too, because you do genuinely feel sorry for this guy, and he really didn't deserve what happened to him, and the story gets really freaking gory.
The next story is a ghost story called Confessions of a Pornographer's Shroud. Very interesting title, and it's rare you get a title that has parentheses in it. But it's actually a very interesting ghost story. It's about a man wrongly accused of a crime, murdered, comes back as a ghost. And there's a little bit of humor here in that as a ghost he is animating the shroud that was covering his body, so that you sort of get that traditional image of the ghost in a white sheet, a very Scooby-Doo image. And then it obviously turns into a revenge story where he is getting revenge against those who, put him in this situation and falsely accused him. And again, this one really shows that Barker likes to play with traditional horror ideas like the Scooby-Doo ghost in a white sheet and just do something completely new with it. It's one of the reasons I love him so much, and particularly why I love his short fiction.
The fourth story in here is called Scape-Goats, and basically it's about these people who are on a yacht, and it crashes on this island that almost seems to have appeared out of nowhere, and the island is covered by fog, so they can't see off the island, and what happens is they end up discovering, like, these sheep in the middle of this island, and it appears that these sheep are an offering to something. That's really all I want to say about the story, but it's a pretty decent story. I would say it's probably my least favorite of the stories contained in this volume, but I did appreciate there's sort of a Rod Serling twist at the end where the main character of the story is this woman, and she really likes this one guy that they're with, and she wishes to be with him, and at the end she kind of gets her wish, just not in the way she would have wanted. And the story does have sort of a criticism of masculinity, or at least society's standards for masculinity, where there's this one guy who really likes the main character, but she kind of wants nothing to do with him, and at a certain point he kills this sheep, thinking that it's going to impress her or something, and killing the sheep is actually what leads to a lot of the problems in the story. Now, in the late 80s, there was an anthology comic book series called Tap in the Vein, which adapted several of the stories from Books of Blood, and this particular story I know was adapted from one of the issues of that series. But it's a pretty decent story, but it's my least favorite of the stories contained in this collection. But now here's my friend Mark giving his thoughts on Scapegoats.
The next story is called Scape-Goats. It's sort of a ghost story about being out at sea and getting stranded at a place where all these bodies of drowned sailors have converged because of the tides and currents. But these dead sailors aren't as dead as you might think they are. So, again, a very interesting idea. It's very creepy. He really knows how to create this atmosphere of dread and fear. Like his writing is very intellectual, but he knows how to get those emotional responses out of you. So also a thumbs up for Scapegoats.
And the final story contained in Books of Blood Volume 3 is Human Remains, which is probably my second favorite story in the collection, next to Son of Celluloid. Basically, Human Remains is about this prostitute who goes to the apartment of one of his Johns, or clients, and this client of his is a collector of rare artifacts, but in the apartment he finds this really bizarre-looking statue that almost appears to be alive. And what happens is the statue ends up taking the form of this young prostitute, and it goes out pretending to be him, and it starts killing people, and now people think this prostitute is a murderer, so he's now on the run from the police. But as the story goes on, you start to realize that this statue is kind of becoming a better person than he is. In a way, the story is sort of a take on the classic Edgar Allan Poe story, William Wilson, but with a very Clive Barker twist. Now, from what I understand, Clive Barker, early in his life, before he found success as a writer, actually did work as a male prostitute, and I'm not judging him by any means for that, but I wonder if Barker maybe took some aspects of his real-life experience and put that into the main character of this story. Now, Human Remains was also adapted in one of the issues of Tap in the Vein as well. But here is my friend Mark's review of Human Remains.
The final story is Human Remains, which is sort of a doppelganger story. It's about a young male prostitute who he's taken home by one of his Johns. He finds this weird statue of a man in the bathroom, and then subsequently he feels like he is being haunted or followed by a doppelganger, like someone who looks like him. And he starts to sort of lose the ability to feel, like his emotions start going numb. He no longer eats or sleeps. And you realize he's sort of trading places with the statue. He's becoming the statue. And he, at the end, he runs into the doppelganger who now has all his emotions and is going off to live his life. I love this sort of story. I don't feel like in modern horror we get enough doppelganger stories, and I really enjoy those. And I also enjoyed that sort of feeling that comes in a story where a character is losing themselves, losing touch with the things in their lives that give them joy and personality. So I actually thought this was a great story to end the collection with. I thought it was really good. Maybe my second. I also just enjoy, because at this point, Clive Barker was not publicly out as a gay man. In private, I think people knew, but the general public didn't. So I loved these stories, like also In the Hills, the Cities, where he uses gay characters. Just as a gay man myself, I really like that. But so overall, Volume 3 of the Books of Blood, I thought was another stellar entry into the series. I think Clive Barker's short fiction, particularly this early fiction, is just outstanding and some of the best stuff out there. And this was a particularly strong volume. But I'm not going to lie, I think all three I think all 6 of them are very strong. But there really wasn't a story in this one that I didn't think was worth your time. So that's my review of Books of Blood, and thank you very much.
So I hope you enjoyed this video, and that was my review on Books of Blood Volume 3 by Clive Barker, and bye.